Canada's incredible population mystery. Imagine a country the size of the entire European continent, a land of wilderness and extremes stretching as far as the eye can see. Now imagine that 90% of its population is squeezed into a narrow strip along just one border. This isn't fiction, it's Canada, the second largest country on Earth. While Canada spans over 3.8 million square miles, most Canadians live within just 100 miles of the United States. What hidden factors force an entire nation to cluster so tightly along its southern edge? The explanation reveals a fascinating interplay of geography, history, and practical realities that shape this unusual population distribution. The answer goes deeper than you might expect. The narrow band, visualizing Canada's population reality. What if I told you that in a country spanning 9.98 million square kilometers, almost everyone lives in a thin strip making up just 4% of the total land area? It sounds almost impossible, yet this is the reality of Canada's population distribution. Look at a satellite image of North America at night, and you'll notice something striking. While the United States glows with city lights spanning coast to coast, Canada appears mostly dark except for a bright line hugging the American border. This illuminated edge reveals where Canadians actually live, creating one of the most extreme population concentrations of any large nation on Earth. The contrast becomes stark when examining the numbers. Canada ranks as the second largest country globally by land area, yet its 38 million people are overwhelmingly clustered within a narrow 100-mile band along its southern edge. To visualize this concentration, picture the entire population of Tokyo confined to a single highway corridor stretching across Japan, while leaving the vast majority of the land virtually empty. Population density maps tell an even more dramatic story. In southern Ontario, particularly in the Greater Toronto area, population density exceeds 1,000 people per square kilometer. The region around Toronto, Hamilton, and the western end of Lake Ontario forms what urban planners call the Golden Horseshoe, a densely populated arc that houses nearly one-third of all Canadians. Contrast this with Nunavut, Canada's largest territory by area, covering approximately one-fifth of Canada's total landmass, equivalent to 3 Texas-sized areas. Nunavut has just 0.02 people per square kilometer. That's one person for every 50 square kilometers, or an area the size of 10 football fields with a single resident. The concentration becomes even more apparent in specific population centers. Toronto, Canada's largest city, houses approximately 3 million people within its city limits and over 6 million in its metropolitan area. This single urban center contains more residents than all 3 northern territories, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut combined, plus all of Canada's northern provincial regions. In fact, these northern populations would fit into a single Toronto neighborhood. This pattern has deep historical roots. Population growth visualizations from the 1800s onward show that while communities formed across the country, the overwhelming majority of growth occurred in that same southern band. From Canada's 3.5 million citizens at Confederation in 1867 to today's 38 million, the proportional distribution has remained remarkably stable, with approximately 90% of Canadians consistently living within 100 miles of the U.S. border for more than a century. What makes this distribution fascinating is how it defies patterns seen in other large countries. While most nations with significant landmass have multiple population centers spread across their territory, Canada maintains this linear concentration along a single border. The St. Lawrence River Corridor serves as the historical backbone of Canadian settlement, with major centers like Montreal and Quebec City along its banks. Moving westward, the Great Lakes region, particularly around Toronto and the Golden Horseshoe, forms another dense cluster. Further west, population density increases again around Vancouver and British Columbia's lower mainland, after a relatively sparse stretch across the prairies, though still following the southern border. These population centers are islands in a vast sea of sparsely inhabited land. From Toronto to Iqaluit, Nunavut's capital, is approximately the same distance as from London to Moscow. Yet while Europe contains dozens of major cities along such a span, in Canada, population density drops dramatically northward. This extreme distribution is evident in transportation infrastructure. The Trans-Canada Highway, the country's main east-west artery, runs almost entirely within that same 100-mile band from the U.S. border. North of this route, road networks become increasingly sparse, eventually giving way to regions with no permanent roads at all. In Nunavut, communities have no connecting roads to each other or the rest of Canada. Air travel is the only year-round option. This highly concentrated pattern creates a distinctive national dynamic. While Canada claims sovereignty over its enormous northern territories, the lived experience of most Canadians is decidedly southern. The average Canadian resides closer to the U.S. border than to Canada's geographical center. Economic activity follows this same distribution. Approximately 90% of Canada's GDP is generated within the southern population band. Major industries, financial centers, manufacturing hubs, and technology clusters are all predominantly located in this region. The Toronto Stock Exchange, Canada's financial heart, sits just 84 miles from the U.S. border. Even Canada's agricultural activity reinforces this pattern. The country's most productive farmland is concentrated in southern regions, particularly southern Ontario's fertile lowlands and the prairie provinces, all within the same band near the U.S. border. North of this agricultural zone, food production capacity drops dramatically. This raises profound questions about what forces created such an unusual distribution. Why would an entire nation's population cling to one edge of its territory? What barriers have prevented northward expansion? The answers lie in a complex interplay of physical geography, historical settlement patterns, economic forces, and infrastructure development. This distribution represents the fundamental reality that has shaped Canada's development as a nation, explaining aspects from its economic structure to its approach to sovereignty, transportation networks, and cultural identity. The uninhabitable North, geography as destiny. While maps show Canada as one continuous nation, the physical reality tells a different story. Beneath that familiar outline exists essentially two Canadas, a narrow habitable zone where people can thrive, and a vast wilderness where permafrost, poor soil, and punishing temperatures conspire to defeat human settlement despite centuries of technological advancement. At the heart of this division lies the Canadian Shield, an enormous geological formation covering approximately 8 million square kilometers, roughly 80% of Canada's total landmass. This ancient geological feature stands as Earth's elder statesman among rock formations, dating back 2.5 to 4 billion years. Like a massive stone fortress carved by time, its surface, scoured repeatedly by massive glaciers during the last ice age, left behind a landscape characterized by exposed bedrock, countless lakes, thin soil, and limited agricultural potential. The shield's composition creates a fundamental barrier to settlement. The hard, impermeable Precambrian rock and glacial scouring left soil depths, averaging just 5 to 10 centimeters in many areas. Far too shallow for conventional farming. Where soil does accumulate, it's typically acidic and nutrient poor, lacking organic materials needed for agriculture. Imagine a settler's disappointment upon arriving from Europe, having heard tales of Canada's vast open spaces, only to discover that their plow breaks against bedrock just inches below the surface. Many early pioneers abandoned homesteads after exhausting themselves trying to clear fields that would never yield enough to feed their families. This geological reality creates a stark contrast. Stand in the farmlands of southern Ontario with its meter-deep topsoil built up over millennia. Then travel a few hundred kilometers north onto the Shield, and you'll find a landscape where growing anything beyond the most hardy wild plants becomes nearly impossible. The Shield essentially forms a natural barrier that divides the country geologically as dramatically as any political border. Before exploring the infrastructure challenges, consider the climate extremes that define life in northern Canada. Winter temperatures regularly plunge to minus 40 degrees Celsius and below, cold enough that exposed skin can freeze in under 5 minutes. Iqaluit, Nunavut's capital, experiences average January temperatures of minus 27 degrees Celsius, with wind chill factors regularly pushing the felt temperature below minus 50 degrees Celsius. These conditions transform simple tasks into survival challenges. Starting a vehicle, walking to school, or fixing a broken pipe become potentially life-threatening activities without proper preparation. Summer brings a different, but equally challenging condition. The brief thaw transforms much of the northern landscape into boggy, insect-infested terrain. The standing water becomes perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes and black flies in such remarkable densities that they can actually impair breathing and visibility. Some northern communities report mosquito densities of over 9 million insects per hectare during peak season. North of the Shield lies another formidable obstacle, permafrost. This permanently frozen ground covers approximately 50% of Canada's land area. In continuous permafrost zones, the ground remains frozen year-round to depths of hundreds of meters, with only the top 0.5 to 2 meters thawing briefly during summer months. The consequences for settlement are profound. Building on permafrost requires extraordinary engineering solutions. Traditional foundations crack and shift as the active layer thaws and refreezes. Structures must be elevated on specialized pilings driven deep into the frozen ground, dramatically increasing construction costs. Climate change is increasingly destabilizing these engineering solutions as warming temperatures cause unpredictable thawing. Between the Shield and the permafrost zones lies another geographical barrier, Canada's boreal forest. Stretching across approximately 2.7 million square kilometers, this vast woodland creates its own impediment. The boreal's dense, often waterlogged terrain historically presented a nearly impenetrable barrier to transportation and development. Even today, building infrastructure through these regions remains prohibitively expensive. The agricultural limitations across northern Canada present perhaps the most fundamental barrier to settlement. Only about 7% of Canada's entire landmass offers conditions suitable for conventional farming. In the far north, the growing season may last just 60 to 80 days, compared to 200-plus days in southern Ontario. This brief window means many staple crops simply cannot mature before frost returns. Even greenhouse agriculture faces challenges, as extended periods of darkness during winter months require artificial lighting, dramatically increasing costs. Northern communities depend on expensive imported food flown or shipped in at great expense. Infrastructure development across these landscapes encounters economic barriers as substantial as the physical ones. A kilometer of all-weather road constructed on permafrost can cost 5 to 8 times more than in southern Canada. Many northern communities remain accessible only by air or seasonal ice roads that operate for just a few weeks each year. Electricity generation presents similar challenges. Vast distances make connecting to southern power grids prohibitively expensive, forcing reliance on diesel generators. The fuel must be shipped or flown in at enormous expense, resulting in electricity costs up to 10 times higher than in southern urban centers. Water and sewage systems face unique challenges in permafrost regions. Pipes cannot be buried without elaborate heating systems. Many northern communities rely on above-ground utilidors, insulated pipelines that transport water and sewage, adding to infrastructure costs. The per capita cost of providing basic services in northern communities can exceed southern equivalents by an order of magnitude. Communications infrastructure follows the same pattern. Low population density makes extending fiber optic networks economically unfeasible. Satellite internet becomes the only option, with higher costs, lower bandwidth, and greater latency than southern urban centers take for granted. First footprints, Indigenous settlement patterns. The technological hurdles of northern settlement aren't just modern problems. They're the latest chapter in a 12,000-year story of human adaptation to Canada's geographical realities. Archaeological evidence reveals a fascinating pattern. The earliest human inhabitants of what would become Canada already understood which regions could sustain larger populations and which demanded more nomadic lifestyles. Excavations across Canada have uncovered stone tools, dwelling remains, and artifacts dating back to approximately 10,000 BCE, when the last ice age retreated and humans began exploring northward. These early inhabitants concentrated in specific areas based on resource availability, climate conditions, and natural transportation corridors. Indigenous settlement patterns reflected deep understanding of environmental constraints and opportunities. In the far north, Inuit communities developed sophisticated hunting strategies focused on marine mammals. Their seasonal movements followed game migrations across vast territories, with population densities remaining necessarily low due to the Arctic's limited carrying capacity. A typical Inuit winter settlement might house just 20 to 30 people, comparable to a modern extended family gathering, in semi-subterranean dwellings, dispersing during summer hunting. Inuit oral traditions speak of Sedna, the goddess of the sea, whose fingers became the seals and walruses upon which communities depended. This mythology reflects practical knowledge of marine resources that sustained life in a harsh environment where attempting agricultural settlement would have meant starvation. In the subarctic region, Dene, Cree, and other Athabascan-speaking peoples established more complex seasonal rounds. They created larger winter encampments near reliable food sources, with fishing stations along major rivers where hundreds might gather seasonally before dispersing into smaller family groups for winter. Hunting. The agricultural societies of southern Canada represented a different adaptation altogether. The Haudenosaunee-Iroquois Confederacy established substantial agricultural settlements throughout southern Ontario and upstate New York. The Crawford Lake site excavations reveal sophisticated communities where pollen analysis confirms extensive corn cultivation by the 13th century. Haudenosaunee built substantial longhouses housing multiple families, with palisade villages containing populations of 1,500 to 2,000 people, roughly the size of a small modern town center. The neighboring Wendat, Huron, developed equally impressive agricultural communities between Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay, with evidence suggesting a total population approaching 30,000 before European contact. Their Three Sisters agricultural system of corn, beans, and squash perfectly adapted to the region's growing season and soil conditions. This concentration of agricultural societies in southern regions corresponded directly to environmental factors. The frost-free growing season in these areas typically lasted 140 to 160 days, compared to just 80 to 100 days further north. The rich glacial soils of southern Ontario and Quebec provided fertility that the Canadian Shield couldn't match, allowing for population densities up to 20 times higher than in the boreal forest regions. Coastal regions developed distinctive settlement patterns based on marine resources. Pacific Coast First Nations established permanent villages with impressive wooden structures, including longhouses housing hundreds. Archaeological middens on Vancouver Island reach depths of several meters, indicating centuries of continuous habitation. Atlantic Coast Mi'kmaq and Maliseet communities developed seasonal rounds centered on coastal resources during summer and inland hunting during winter. Indigenous trade networks mirrored the same geographical patterns we see today. Major waterways, especially the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes system, served as superhighways for exchange. Copper from Lake Superior mines reached communities thousands of kilometers away, while seashells from the Atlantic appeared in inland settlements throughout the eastern woodlands. The St. Lawrence River formed the backbone of an extensive trade network connecting diverse cultural groups. At Hochelaga, near present-day Montreal, Jacques Cartier encountered a substantial Iroquoian settlement housing approximately 1,500 people. This location controlled a critical transportation junction between the Great Lakes and Atlantic regions. This geographical knowledge influenced population distribution dramatically. Pre-contact population densities in southern Ontario reached 8 to 12 people per square kilometer in fertile areas, comparable to parts of contemporary Europe. By contrast, Canadian Shield densities averaged less than 0.1 person per square kilometer. This hundredfold difference demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the landscape's carrying capacity. Indigenous engineering further adapted to local conditions through innovations like stonefish weirs in British Columbia, raised bed agriculture in southern Ontario, and strategically placed buffalo jumps on the prairies. Each represented a specific adaptation to local geographical realities. The archaeological record reveals a remarkable conclusion. Canada's basic population distribution pattern was established thousands of years before European arrival. Indigenous peoples had thoroughly mapped habitable regions, identified optimal settlement locations, established transportation corridors, and developed regionally appropriate subsistence strategies. They concentrated in the same southern regions where most Canadians live today because those areas offered the most favorable conditions for sustaining larger populations. When Europeans arrived, they adopted settlement patterns already established by Indigenous peoples. The story of the Canadian Mohawk guide who showed early French settlers the optimal portage routes around the Lachine Rapids illustrates how Europeans relied on Indigenous geographical knowledge. French colonists settled along the St. Lawrence because Indigenous communities had already demonstrated its value. English settlements similarly followed existing Indigenous population centers. This Indigenous blueprint for habitation would become the foundation upon which Canada's modern settlement patterns would be built, with newcomers following established knowledge, often acquired through alliance, trade, or conquest. The wisdom of thousands of years of adaptation would guide European settlement strategies, even as the original knowledge holders were increasingly displaced from their lands. Rivers of empire, colonial settlement foundations. Colonial powers didn't just adopt Indigenous settlement patterns. They institutionalized them through systems of land distribution that still shape Canada's population today. When French explorers first navigated the St. Lawrence in the early 1600s, they weren't simply seeking adventure. They were following specific economic and strategic imperatives that would determine where Europeans would establish permanent footholds in North America. Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City in 1608 at a strategic narrows of the St. Lawrence, where the river could be controlled. This calculated decision established a defensible position on an existing trade route. The initial French colonies functioned primarily as trading posts designed to extract wealth through the fur trade, particularly beaver, pelts highly valued in European markets. For decades, French presence in New France remained limited to trading posts along waterways. Indigenous partners performed much of the trapping work, traveling vast distances to bring furs to French merchants. This created a settlement pattern distinct from the agricultural focus of British colonies to the south. Then came the seigneurial system in 1627, a pivotal development when the Crown realized resource extraction alone couldn't sustain the colony. This feudal model, adapted from France to North American geography, transformed settlement patterns permanently. Land grants, called seigneuries, were distributed along the St. Lawrence River and its tributaries as narrow rectangles stretching back from the riverbank. This distinctive shape served practical purposes, providing farmers river access for transportation, allowing dense settlement along waterways, and facilitating communication between neighbors. The legacy of this system remains visible in satellite imagery today. From above, these long, narrow farm plots extend from the St. Lawrence like ribs from a spine, a landscape tattoo of colonial policy. More importantly, this system concentrated population along the river corridor rather than dispersing it inland. By 1760, when British forces captured Quebec during the 7 Years' War, approximately 70,000 French settlers had established themselves primarily along the St. Lawrence River. The 1763 Treaty of Paris transferred New France to British control, but the settlement pattern was irreversibly established. In response, British colonial authorities preserved these settlement patterns rather than attempting drastic changes. The Quebec Act of 1774 formally recognized many French civil laws and land distribution systems, effectively preserving the seigneurial pattern. British colonial policy shifted to developing English-speaking settlements in Atlantic Canada and around the Great Lakes, regions chosen for agricultural potential and strategic importance. Halifax, established in 1749, served as a military counterbalance to the French fortress at Louisbourg. The American Revolution accelerated British settlement dramatically. Between 1776 and 1784, approximately 40,000 United Empire Loyalists fled north. Rather than dispersing throughout British North America, they concentrated in specific southern regions. The Maritimes, particularly New Brunswick, Quebec's eastern townships, and the North Shore of Lake Ontario. British land distribution followed a rectangular township grid pattern, distinct from the seigneurial system. However, these townships still concentrated in the southernmost regions with milder climates and better agricultural potential. This created a lifeline of settlement hugging the border, a pattern that would define Canada's population distribution for centuries. The War of 1812 reinforced this southern concentration. Fearing American expansion, British authorities increased military presence along the frontier and encouraged civilian settlement as a buffer zone. New military outposts were established at strategic points, many evolving into important urban centers. Kingston grew from a military base into a commercial hub, while York, later Toronto, developed from a garrison town into Upper Canada's capital. These strategic considerations drove infrastructure investment along the southern frontier. The Rideau Canal, completed in 1832, created a secure military supply route connecting Kingston to Bytown, later Ottawa. This expensive project wasn't intended to push settlement northward, but to better connect existing settlements along the colony's southern edge. Transportation realities further cemented this pattern. Before railways, water routes served as the era's superhighways, making waterfront settlement vastly more economical than inland locations. When railways finally arrived in the 1850s, they followed existing population centers rather than pioneering new ones. The Grand Trunk Railway, completed in 1860, ran along the established corridor from Montreal to Toronto to Sarnia. By Confederation in 1867, Canada's population distribution was firmly established. The vast majority of the new Dominion's 3.5 million inhabitants lived within 100 miles of the U.S. border, concentrated along the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence. This wasn't a temporary phase, but a foundation for future growth. Colonial decisions about settlement locations, influenced by transportation needs, agricultural potential, military strategy, and Indigenous knowledge, created a population framework that subsequent developments reinforced rather than redirected. The economic logic placing European settlements in southern locations remained compelling for later generations. These patterns became self-reinforcing through infrastructure development, economic activity, and institutional inertia. Once established, population centers rarely shift significantly. The economic magnet, proximity to markets. The gravitational pull of the United States economy has been so powerful that it's essentially frozen Canada's population in place for generations. How much economic force does it take to keep 90% of a country's population within 100 miles of a border that stretches nearly 4,000 miles long? The answer lies in the staggering economic imbalance between these neighboring nations. Each morning in Windsor, Ontario, thousands of Canadians cross the Ambassador Bridge into Detroit. They're teachers, engineers, and healthcare workers, Canadian residents whose livelihoods depend on American employers. This daily migration illustrates a profound economic reality. The American economy is approximately 10 times larger than Canada's. This creates an economic landscape where Canadian prosperity depends largely on access to American markets, capital, and supply chains. When your neighbor buys 3/4 of everything you produce, you build your economic centers close to their doorstep. This economic magnetism operates on multiple levels. Canada exports over $450 billion worth of goods and services to the United States annually, representing approximately 75% of Canada's total exports, a degree of economic dependence unmatched by any other major developed economy. This trade forms the backbone of Canada's entire economic structure. The Windsor-Quebec City Corridor demonstrates this economic reality most clearly. This 1,100-kilometer stretch contains Canada's manufacturing heartland, with industrial centers positioned strategically close to American markets. Montreal sits just 70 kilometers from the U.S. border, with direct connections to New York. Toronto's manufacturing suburbs extend toward Buffalo and Detroit. Windsor, known as Automotive Alley, sits directly across from Detroit, creating integrated production systems spanning the border. The Ambassador Bridge alone carries approximately 25% of all merchandise trade between Canada and the U.S., over $100 billion worth of goods annually. A single bridge handling a quarter of the trade between two G7 nations reveals how concentrated these economic connections have become. Canadian businesses position themselves near American markets, creating clusters of economic activity. Manufacturing facilities locate an average of 30% closer to the U.S. border than non-manufacturing businesses. This proximity reduces transportation costs, allows for just-in-time delivery, and facilitates personnel movement between operations. When your primary customer is south of the border, every kilometer northward represents added costs and competitive disadvantages. This border-hugging tendency intensified after the Auto Pact of 1965, which eliminated tariffs on vehicles and parts between the two countries. The result was a massive concentration of auto manufacturing in southern Ontario, particularly around Windsor, Oshawa, and Oakville, all within 100 kilometers of the U.S. border. The Auto Pact created a virtuous cycle for border communities. As automotive plants expanded, parts suppliers clustered nearby. Steel producers, tool makers, and logistics companies followed. Housing, retail, and services grew to support the manufacturing workforce. Within a generation, Southern Ontario had transformed into a manufacturing powerhouse linked to Detroit's automotive industry. This economic integration deepened with the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement in 1989 and NAFTA in 1994, later USMCA in 2018. These agreements eliminated most tariffs and created a continental market of over 450 million consumers, making border proximity even more valuable for Canadian businesses. Consider Sarnia, Ontario, once a small border town that now hosts Chemical Valley, a massive petrochemical complex processing crude oil from Western Canada. Over 40% of Canada's chemical industry concentrates in this single border location, employing thousands in high-paying jobs dependent on cross-border supply chains. How did one town become so crucial to an entire national industry? It's positioned directly across from Port Huron. Michigan made it the ideal location for processing resources bound for American markets. Even high-technology industries follow this pattern. Canada's technology triangle, encompassing Kitchener-Waterloo-Cambridge, sits just over an hour from the U.S. border. This proximity allows tech firms to serve American clients while leveraging Canadian talent and innovation incentives. When BlackBerry grew into a global technology leader, it maintained headquarters in Waterloo partly because of this strategic position near American markets and Toronto's international connections. The economic pull extends beyond manufacturing into services as well. Canada's financial sector concentrates in Toronto, just 90 minutes from Buffalo. The Toronto Stock Exchange processes billions in daily transactions with American investors. Entertainment industries cluster in Vancouver and Toronto, both positioned to serve American markets while offering production advantages. This pattern creates entire economic ecosystems around border proximity. When a manufacturing plant locates near the border, it generates demand for suppliers, logistics, professional services, and consumer businesses. These secondary businesses create further demand, establishing self-reinforcing economic clusters over time. The economic data confirms this concentration effect. Border regions like Southern Ontario generate per capita GDP figures significantly higher than provinces farther from the U.S. Household incomes in border communities exceed the national average by approximately 15%, reflecting the economic premium of border proximity. American companies investing in Canada typically establish operations within 100 kilometers of the border, allowing for integrated management. Over 70% of foreign direct investment in Canadian manufacturing flows into border provinces, concentrated around major crossing points. even as digital communications theoretically reduce the importance of physical proximity, the economic magnetism of the border remains powerful. Canada's most successful technology firms maintain their primary operations in the southern population belt. The ecosystem of talent, venture capital, and supporting services remains concentrated near the border, where connections to American markets are strongest. What would it take to reshape this economic geography? The gravitational pull of the world's largest economy continues to define where Canadians live, work, and build their futures. Paths of least resistance, infrastructure, and urban development. Beyond market forces, something even more permanent has cemented Canada's population distribution, the physical infrastructure that makes modern life possible. When the first rails of the Canadian Pacific Railway were hammered into place in 1881, they were mapping out where generations of Canadians would make their homes for centuries to come. This phenomenon is known as path dependency, the idea that once certain investments or decisions are made, they create conditions that make it increasingly difficult to deviate from that chosen path. In Canada's case, the early infrastructure decisions, particularly transportation networks, created a self-reinforcing cycle that has locked the population firmly along the southern edge of the country. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885 represented the first national infrastructure project that physically connected Canada's scattered populations. The famous Last Spike ceremony at Craigellachie, British Columbia established the skeleton of Canada's future development. The railway's route was carefully plotted to connect existing population centers while avoiding the most challenging terrain. This meant staying well south of the Canadian Shield and permafrost regions, creating a transcontinental corridor that roughly followed the path of least resistance, the southern band of more hospitable territory. The railway created new communities, as well as connecting existing ones. Towns like Medicine Hat, Moose Jaw, and Swift Current sprang into existence as railway maintenance points and agricultural collection centers. Within years of the railway's completion, these whistle stops transformed into permanent settlements. The CPR offered incentives to European immigrants to settle along its route, distributing millions of acres of farmland through aggressive marketing campaigns that promised prosperity in the last best west. This strategic development ensured the railway would have both customers and freight to transport, while simultaneously reinforcing settlement patterns along its southern route. When automobiles emerged in the early 20th century, road networks naturally developed to connect these established railway towns. By the time the Trans-Canada Highway was formally planned in the 1950s, the decision to route it through existing population centers was essentially predetermined. The highway, stretching over 7,800 kilometers from Victoria to St. John's, closely parallels the CPR route across much of the country, rarely straying more than 200 kilometers from the American border. This historical transportation backbone established the foundation upon which all modern infrastructure would later build. Electrical grids, telecommunications networks, and digital infrastructure followed these same corridors because that's where people already lived. Consider electrical infrastructure. Canada's main power transmission corridors follow the southern population belt because that's where the demand existed. The national power grid developed as a series of regional networks in highly populated areas before eventually connecting into larger systems. Building high-voltage transmission lines through hundreds of kilometers of uninhabited wilderness made little economic sense. So, electrical infrastructure followed the same. Southern Corridor as transportation networks. The development of major urban centers further solidified this pattern. Cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver became essential hubs where multiple transportation systems converged: rail, road, sea, and eventually air. These networks created natural economic advantages that attracted businesses, institutions, and people. The growth of these cities then justified further infrastructure investments, creating a virtuous cycle of development, but only within that same southern band. Building infrastructure in Canada's north has always been prohibitively expensive by comparison. The costs escalate dramatically due to harsh conditions, complex engineering challenges, shorter construction seasons, and the vast distances involved. A basic two-lane highway constructed in northern regions might cost 3 to 5 times more per kilometer than an equivalent project in southern Canada. The Dempster Highway, the only all-weather road reaching the Arctic Ocean in North America, required an average of 2.4 meters of gravel fill as a base layer to prevent the roadbed from melting the permafrost beneath it. This engineering requirement alone increased construction costs by orders of magnitude. For northern communities, these infrastructure gaps translate to daily struggles. When internet connections fail in places like Nunavut, businesses can't process credit card payments, hospitals face challenges accessing patient records, and families lose their connection to the wider world. The infrastructure that Southern Canadians take for granted becomes a luxury in these regions. Similar cost disparities exist across all infrastructure categories. Telecommunications companies must invest far more per potential customer to extend service into remote regions. The CRTC estimates that providing equivalent internet service to northern communities costs 5 to 10 times more than in southern urban areas. Power generation in isolated northern communities frequently relies on diesel generators rather than connection to the national grid, because the expense of extending high-voltage transmission lines across hundreds of kilometers of wilderness exceeds any reasonable cost-benefit analysis. The Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway opened in 2017 to connect the Arctic Ocean to Canada's highway network, cost $300 million for just 137 kilometers, about $2.2 million per kilometer. By comparison, highway construction in southern Ontario typically runs between $3 to $8 million per kilometer for a much larger 4-lane divided highway. Canada's airports demonstrate this same pattern. The country's busiest air hubs all sit within 200 kilometers of the U.S. border. Even when northern communities receive air service, the network is designed around connections through these southern hubs rather than direct routes between northern points. A traveler flying from Iqaluit to Whitehorse must typically connect through Ottawa or another southern city, as the passenger volume doesn't justify direct flights between northern communities. This infrastructure reality has profound implications for national development. The enormous sunk costs in existing southern infrastructure create a powerful inertia that resists significant population redistribution. Even as technology theoretically makes remote work more feasible, the basic requirements for modern life depend on physical infrastructure that remains concentrated in the South. The existing infrastructure network represents trillions of dollars of investment over generations. This enormous financial commitment cannot easily be replicated elsewhere, creating a lock-in effect that reinforces the existing population distribution. New communities and businesses naturally gravitate toward locations where they can leverage this existing infrastructure rather than pioneering development in regions where basic services would need to be built from scratch. Global comparisons. How Canada differs. That infrastructure lock-in effect raises a profound question. Is Canada's extraordinary population distribution unique on the global stage? When we examine other vast nations with challenging northern territories, we discover that Canada stands as perhaps the most unusual population distribution experiment in the developed world. No other major country concentrates its population so extremely along a single border, not even those with similarly harsh climates and extensive territories. Russia provides the most natural comparison. While it shares Canada's challenge of a vast northern expanse, Russia's population spreads more evenly across its territory. About 75% of Russians live in the European portion of the country, which constitutes roughly 25% of Russia's landmass. Unlike Canada's tight border concentration, Russian settlements form a more gradual gradient, with significant population centers like Novosibirsk and Ekaterinburg situated deep within Siberia. Russia maintains major urban centers. Above the Arctic Circle, Murmansk, with over 300,000 residents, stands as the world's largest city north of the Arctic Circle. Norilsk, despite its isolation and extreme climate with temperatures regularly dropping below minus 30 degrees Celsius, supports a population of 175,000 people, more than all 3 Canadian territories combined. These Arctic cities developed through massive Soviet-era investment, resembling a root system spreading deep into the territory rather than Canada's thin line of habitation. The Scandinavian countries offer another revealing contrast. Norway, Sweden, and Finland all maintain significant populations well above the 60th parallel, territory that's largely uninhabited in Canada. In Norway, cities like Tromsø, population 77,000, thrive at 69 degrees north latitude, farther north than Yellowknife. The Gulf Stream creates milder coastal climates, but equally important are centuries of continuous settlement and government policies supporting northern development. Sweden has pursued deliberate policies to maintain balanced regional development. Its northern city of Kiruna, home to 23,000 people, exists far above the Arctic Circle and is being physically relocated to accommodate mining operations, an infrastructure investment unimaginable in northern Canada. The government has established universities and technology hubs in northern regions, creating economic opportunities beyond resource extraction. Australia presents a different distribution pattern altogether. Like Canada, Australia concentrates its population in a small portion of its landmass, but the distribution follows a coastal ring rather than a linear border. About 85% of Australians live within 50 kilometers of the coast, yet this population forms a perimeter around the entire continent. Major cities like Perth exist in relative isolation on the western coast, thousands of kilometers from eastern population centers, creating a more balanced national footprint despite the harsh interior, like a protective membrane around the continent compared to Canada's one-sided concentration. Even countries with challenging geography maintain widely distributed populations. China's population spreads across diverse landscapes from coastal plains to high plateaus, with significant settlements in regions like Tibet despite harsh conditions. India's population spans from the Himalayan foothills to tropical coastal regions, with major centers distributed throughout the subcontinent rather than concentrated in any single zone. What makes these comparisons revealing is that Canada's extreme population distribution isn't simply about climate or geography. Other factors must be at work. Scandinavia supports thriving communities at latitudes where Canada is virtually uninhabited. The key differences appear in historical development patterns and economic incentives. The timing of settlement plays a crucial role. While Scandinavian countries have maintained continuous northern populations for thousands of years, allowing for gradual adaptation and infrastructure development, Canada's northern regions faced rapid, resource-driven settlement much later in history. The established patterns in the South created a gravitational pull that never existed in countries with more historical population balance. Economic policies differ dramatically across these nations. Russia's northern cities were established through centrally planned Soviet policies that prioritized territorial control over economic efficiency. The government constructed entire cities regardless of cost, supporting them with massive subsidies. Similarly, Scandinavian countries implemented strong regional development policies with tax incentives and infrastructure investments to maintain balanced population distribution. The United States border effect remains unique to Canada. While other major countries interact with multiple neighbors of varying economic status, Canada alone shares such an economically dominant neighbor along a single border, creating a powerful attraction that reinforces settlement patterns. This creates what might be called a magnetic edge, pulling Canadian development south rather than allowing it to spread inward. These distribution patterns profoundly affect national identity. While Canada's vast northern territories feature prominently in its national imagery, most Canadians experience them only through media or occasional tourism. In contrast, northern regions play a more integrated role in Russian and Scandinavian national life, with larger portions of the population having direct connections to these areas. Looking at population density maps across these countries makes the difference visually striking. Canada appears as a thin line of light along the southern edge, with darkness covering most of the country. Russia shows a bright European core that gradually fades eastward with distinct points of light deep into Siberia. Australia presents a ring of illumination around its perimeter. The visual evidence confirms what the data suggests. Canada's population distribution stands as an outlier even among countries with challenging geographies. Canada's extraordinary concentration, 90% of Canadians within 100 miles of the U.S. border, represents a unique historical and economic experiment without parallel among major nations. While other countries with similar geographical challenges developed more balanced distributions through different historical trajectories and economic policies, Canada evolved into perhaps the world's most lopsided population pattern relative to its territorial expanse. Northern dreams, failed attempts to populate the North. The stark contrast between Canada's illuminated southern border and its dark northern expanse isn't merely the result of natural settlement patterns. It represents decades of thwarted ambition. Since the mid-20th century, the Canadian government has invested billions of dollars in northern development initiatives, launching grand strategies designed to redistribute the population and establish thriving communities in the vast territorial North. These weren't casual efforts, but deliberate national projects backed by significant resources and political capital. Yet time and again, these ambitious plans have yielded disappointing results. Half-empty towns, abandoned infrastructure, and a persistent gravitational pullback toward the American border. In the remote community of Flin Flon, straddling the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border, the local museum displays faded photographs of a bustling main street from the 1960s. Back then, over 10,000 residents filled the streets, schools, and copper zinc mine that gave the town its purpose. Today, walking those same streets reveals boarded storefronts and for sale signs on family homes. The population has dwindled below 5,000 as younger residents migrate southward, leaving behind aging infrastructure and rising service costs. "We loved it here," explains former resident Sarah Matheson, who relocated her family to Winnipeg in 2018. But when the mine started cutting jobs, the future just wasn't here anymore. This story repeats across Canada's north, a graveyard of ambitious development schemes that have struggled against geography, climate, and economic gravity. The most concentrated push to populate Canada's north emerged in the late 1950s under Prime Minister John Diefenbaker's bold Northern Vision policy. Addressing Parliament in 1958, Diefenbaker proclaimed, "This national development policy will create a new sense of national purpose and national destiny. One Canada, one nation, where Canadians will have preserved to them the control of their own economic and political destiny." His government earmarked unprecedented funding for Arctic infrastructure, proposing a Roads to Resources program to build 2,850 kilometers of new highways into remote resource-rich regions. The centerpiece of Diefenbaker's vision was Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, a government-designed community built from scratch to demonstrate modern living above the Arctic Circle. Engineers developed innovative utilidors, above-ground insulated corridors housing water, sewage, and heating pipes that couldn't be buried in permafrost. By 1961, Inuvik was functioning, but at a cost equivalent to $1.5 billion today, 10 times the original budget. While Inuvik survives with about 3,500 residents, the infrastructure costs remain staggering, approximately 8 times higher per resident than southern communities. Similar attempts followed in Frobisher Bay, now Iqaluit, where distinctive blue 512 apartment buildings were constructed for Arctic conditions, but proved inappropriate for traditional Inuit family structures. Despite massive investments, Iqaluit's growth remained modest and dependent on federal expenditures. The Northwest Territories capital of Yellowknife represents perhaps the most successful northern development story, growing to 20,000 residents by 2016. Yet even this relative success reveals the limitations of government-driven population redistribution. The federal government spends roughly $28,000 annually per resident on services and infrastructure in the Northwest Territories, triple the national average. Water systems maintenance costs 4 times more per household than in southern cities due to permafrost conditions. Despite this investment, Yellowknife struggles with retention, with professionals typically staying just 3 to 5 years before returning south. The creation of Nunavut in 1999 marks Canada's largest northern development initiative, a vast territory established through the largest land claim settlement in Canadian history, with over $1.1 billion in compensation. 20 years later, Nunavut faces enormous challenges. Its 25 communities remain unconnected by roads, relying on air transport at costs 5 to 10 times higher than ground transportation. Internet connections operate at speeds reminiscent of dial-up in many communities. Housing shortages have reached crisis levels, with over half of Nunavut Inuit living in overcrowded conditions. Government positions often remain unfilled or staffed by short-term Southern professionals. Even substantial incentives fail to stem the tide south. Northern living allowances of up to $22,000 annually for government employees, medical school spots reserved for Northern residents, signing bonuses exceeding $100,000 for healthcare workers, yet a 2018 survey revealed the true obstacles. Spousal employment, children's education, and healthcare access drove professionals south despite significantly higher salaries. The economics explain much of this reluctance. In small northern communities, healthcare facilities cost $18,000 per capita annually compared to $4,000 in urban centers. Schools may cost $30,000 per student annually, nearly triple southern rates. These realities force difficult choices between limited services or severely underutilized infrastructure. This pattern of northern development attempts reflects a stubborn reality. The gravitational pull southward has proven remarkably resistant to government intervention. Communities like Yellowknife and Iqaluit function as territorial capitals with substantial permanent populations, but they remain heavily subsidized islands in a vast territory that continues to resist large-scale settlement despite billions invested. What would it truly take to break the gravitational pull back south? The history of Canada's northern development attempts suggests that government investment alone cannot overcome the fundamental challenges of distance, climate, and isolation. Perhaps the question isn't how to force northern development, but whether the current pattern of settlement represents a rational adaptation to Canada's geographic realities, one that concentrates population where it can be most efficiently supported while maintaining a lighter climate change across the vast northern territories. While government policy has repeatedly failed to populate Canada's north, an unexpected force may succeed where billions in investment couldn't. The Arctic is warming at more than twice the global average rate, transforming vast frozen territories into potentially habitable land, and raising a provocative question. Could climate change accomplish what decades of deliberate northern development policies never could? Climate scientists have documented alarming changes in Canada's Arctic regions. Average annual temperatures in Nunavut have already increased by approximately 2.7 degrees Celsius since 1948, nearly triple the global average. This accelerated warming is projected to continue, with some climate models suggesting northern Canada could experience temperature increases of 4 to 8 degrees Celsius by 2100 under high-emission scenarios. These stark figures signal a fundamental reshaping of Canada's northern landscape, where winter's iron grip is gradually loosening, transforming the very foundation of northern life. The implications for Canada's permafrost regions are particularly significant. Currently, building on permafrost requires specialized and expensive techniques, including elevating structures on adjustable piles and installing cooling systems to prevent heat transfer. But as nature's frozen hold retreats northward, vast territories previously unbuildable may become viable for conventional construction. According to the Geological Survey of Canada, the southern edge of continuous permafrost could shift northward by 100 to 200 kilometers by mid-century, potentially opening millions of hectares to more affordable development, turning what was once frozen wasteland into buildable terrain. Agricultural possibilities present perhaps the most transformative potential. Climate projections suggest growing seasons could extend by 3 to 4 weeks across much of Canada's north by 2050. The prairie provinces may see their agricultural zones push 300 to 500 kilometers further north as frost-free days increase. In parts of the Northwest Territories and Yukon, areas previously limited to 70-day growing seasons could soon support 100-plus day seasons, making commercial agriculture viable for the first time. Canadian agricultural researchers have already begun experimental farms in these transitional zones, testing cold-hardy crops like barley, oats, and certain potato varieties. This agricultural expansion could dramatically alter settlement patterns. Historical precedent suggests that agricultural viability drives population growth. The same process that originally established Canada's southern concentration could potentially be replicated further north. Communities like High Level, Alberta, and Fort Nelson, British Columbia could become regional hubs in an expanded agricultural frontier. The opening of Arctic shipping routes represents another profound change. As Arctic sea ice continues its precipitous decline, both the Northwest Passage through Canada's Arctic archipelago and the Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coast are becoming increasingly navigable. By the 2040s, climate models project that the Northwest Passage could be reliably ice-free for 3 to 4 months annually. This would reduce shipping distances between Asia and Europe by up to 7,000 kilometers compared to the Panama Canal route, creating economic incentives for port development along Canada's northern coastline, potentially bringing thousands of maritime jobs to communities that have long struggled with limited economic opportunities. The Canadian government has recognized this potential, investing $175 million to expand the port at Churchill, Manitoba. Other communities like Tuktoyaktuk and Iqaluit could transform from isolated outposts to strategic maritime hubs, creating employment opportunities beyond resource extraction and establishing self-sustaining economic centers in the north. Resource development will likely accelerate as climate change improves accessibility. The Canadian Arctic contains an estimated 30% of the country's remaining conventional oil resources and 35% of its natural gas. Mining potential is similarly vast, with significant deposits of zinc, lead, copper, gold, and rare earth elements becoming increasingly accessible as permafrost constraints diminish. The Geological Survey of Canada estimates that more than $1 trillion in mineral resources may lie within territories that will become economically viable to extract by mid-century. Climate change presents both opportunity and peril for northern communities. The same forces making the region more accessible simultaneously threaten existing infrastructure. The same permafrost thaw that opens new areas for construction endangers roads, airstrips, and buildings already constructed. The Alaska Highway now requires repairs costing an additional $40 to $60 million annually due to thaw-related damage. Similarly, the Dempster Highway has seen maintenance costs increase by approximately 25% in the past decade as ground instability increases. Water management presents another complex challenge. While northern precipitation is projected to increase by 20 to 30% by mid-century, much will come as rainfall rather than snow. This shift is already causing more frequent flooding and erosion. The hamlet of Kugluktuk in Nunavut has been forced to relocate critical infrastructure multiple times due to unprecedented coastal erosion, at a cost exceeding $25 million. While climate change may make the North more habitable, it simultaneously threatens many southern population centers. Major cities face increasing vulnerability to extreme weather events. Toronto has experienced a 240% increase in heavy precipitation events since the 1950s, leading to devastating floods in 2013 and 2017 that caused over $1 billion in damages. Vancouver faces rising sea levels, threatening its densely populated coastal areas. Montreal has seen a tripling of extreme heat days since 1980, with associated health impacts particularly affecting vulnerable populations. These climate pressures in southern regions, combined with increasing habitability in the north, could gradually shift population distribution patterns. Climate migration models suggest that by 2080, between 100,000 and 350,000 Canadians might relocate northward in response to changing environmental conditions, potentially bringing new energy, ideas, and development to regions long considered too harsh for widespread settlement. Indigenous communities face perhaps the most complex set of challenges and opportunities. Traditional practices are already disrupted by changing wildlife patterns and reduced ice stability. However, many northern Indigenous communities have become leaders in climate adaptation, combining traditional knowledge with modern technologies. The Vuntut First Nation in Yukon has established a solar farm that reduces diesel dependency while creating local employment. The federal government has begun acknowledging these changes, with Canada's Northern Strategy increasingly incorporating climate adaptation. Recent infrastructure investments include $570 million for climate-resilient northern housing and $400 million for transportation networks designed to withstand changing conditions, suggesting recognition that climate change may succeed where deliberate development policies failed by fundamentally altering the physical conditions that have historically kept Canadians clustered along the southern border. A nation defined, identity, and the border. This concentration of population along the southern border has created one of the most fascinating paradoxes in Canadian identity. Canada proudly presents itself as a northern nation, yet the vast majority of its citizens experience this northernness primarily through symbols and imagination rather than lived reality. The anthem itself proclaims the true North strong and free, but most Canadians experience winter as a seasonal inconvenience rather than the defining condition it is in the territories. This contradiction becomes evident in how Canadians have mythologized their relationship with the North. The group of 7 painters, who rose to prominence in the 1920s, deliberately created a national aesthetic centered around the rugged landscapes of the Canadian Shield and Northern Wilderness. Their vivid depictions of windswept pines, crystalline lakes, and imposing rock formations became iconic representations of Canadianness, despite depicting landscapes most Canadians rarely visit. The mysterious death of Tom Thomson in Algonquin Park further romanticized the northern wilderness in Canadian imagination. Canadian currency and commercial imagery reinforce this northern mythology. From the hockey scenes on the $5 bill to the Arctic imagery on the $20 note, official symbols consistently invoke a northern identity that contrasts with most citizens' daily urban experiences. I sing about our great northern wilderness in my music, reflects Toronto-based musician Sarah McLean, yet I've spent maybe 2 weeks of my life north of Sudbury. My Canada is concrete, diversity, and public transit, but I still feel connected to those forests I rarely see. This disconnect is stark in the numbers. A 2019 Environics Institute poll found that 71% of Canadians strongly associated their national identity with wilderness and nature, while 83% lived in urban areas. When selecting images representing Canada, respondents overwhelmingly chose northern landscapes over urban skylines, despite spending their lives in cities and suburbs. The imagined North serves a crucial psychological function for Canadians living in the South. It provides a distinctive national identity separate from the United States, a way to say we are not American, without directly referencing their neighbor. The North becomes a mythological frontier that distinguishes Canadian identity, even as most citizens cluster along the border of the very country they define themselves against. Canadian author Margaret Atwood observed that the central symbol of America is the frontier, always moving outward, while Canada's symbol is survival in a harsh landscape. This orientation toward survival rather than conquest has profoundly influenced Canadian social policies, which emphasize collective well-being over individual achievement. Living close to the world's most powerful cultural and economic force has required Canada to develop strong policy differences to maintain its distinct identity. The nation's universal healthcare system stands in stark contrast to the American private insurance model. Canada's stricter gun regulations, which resulted in firearm homicide rates 1/7 that of the United States, represent another clear policy divergence reflecting different social priorities. Multiculturalism emerged as a distinctive Canadian approach to nation building. While the United States embraced the melting pot metaphor, Canada officially adopted multiculturalism as policy in 1971, becoming the first country in the world to do so. This recognized that a country spanning such vast territory with a relatively small population needed to accommodate diversity rather than enforce conformity. The border proximity has created what some scholars call a Garrison mentality in Canadian culture, a sense of needing to defend against American cultural dominance. This mentality manifests in content regulations requiring Canadian television and radio to include specific percentages of Canadian content, government funding for arts and literature, and educational curricula that emphasize Canadian achievements. Yet this border-hugging population distribution has also made Canada one of the world's most urban and diverse societies. Greater Toronto now ranks as one of the most multicultural metropolitan areas globally, with over 51% of residents born outside Canada. Vancouver similarly counts nearly 45% of its population as foreign-born. This level of diversity exceeds comparable American cities and has occurred precisely because Canada's urban, southern concentration created dense, economically vibrant communities with strong global connections. The urban character of Canadian life stands in contrast to the wilderness imagery dominating national symbols. While Canadians romanticize cabin life and northern lights, their daily reality involves navigating multicultural urban neighborhoods, working in office towers, and participating in a thoroughly modern economy. This tension extends into political discourse. Politicians regularly invoke the North when discussing Canadian sovereignty, yet the federal government maintains a minimal presence there compared to its intensive focus on urban centers. The three Northern Territories hold just 3 seats in Parliament, despite comprising approximately 40% of Canada's landmass, while Ontario and Quebec together hold 199 of 338 seats. For Indigenous peoples, particularly those in northern communities, this romantic view of the North as pristine wilderness has often marginalized their presence and sovereignty. The disparity between how urban Canadians imagine northern landscapes and the lived reality of communities facing housing shortages and food insecurity represents another dimension of this national contradiction. As climate change transforms Arctic regions, many Canadians may encounter the true North primarily as an environmental challenge rather than a mythic landscape. Resource companies view warming temperatures as an opportunity, while territorial governments struggle with thawing permafrost. How will this uniquely Canadian paradox evolve as the physical North changes and urban centers grow increasingly diverse? Can a nation continue to define itself through landscapes most citizens never experience? Or will new symbols of identity emerge that better reflect Canada's urban, multicultural reality? As we've explored the forces that have shaped Canada's unique population pattern, we can appreciate how powerfully geography, history, economics, and infrastructure have worked in concert to create this reality. Human settlement ultimately bows to practical constraints, regardless of our ambitions or policies. We build our communities where survival is easiest and opportunities greatest. This principle extends beyond Canada's borders. As climate change reshapes habitability patterns worldwide, populations will respond accordingly. Maps reveal stories beyond cartographers' intentions. Canada's map shows us that invisible forces, geological, historical, economic, shape nations more profoundly than government directives. What invisible patterns are you noticing